Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your year ahead horoscope forecast for the zodiac sign of Aquarius for the entire year ahead of 2022. If you're new to my channel, then my name is Chris Brennan, and I'm the host of the Astrology podcast and the author of a book on ancient astrology titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune. So in my approach, I synthesize a little bit of ancient and a little bit of modern astrology in order to get the best of both worlds. So each week I release new podcasts and videos on astrology on my channel. So if you'd like to get notifications when I release a new video, then please hit the subscribe button here on YouTube. And if you enjoy this video, then please consider hitting the like button to show me that you enjoyed the content and you'd like to see more of it. Okay, so my horoscopes are primarily meant to be read relative to your rising sign or your ascendant sign, which are essentially the same things. Although you can also watch them from the perspective of your sun sign, especially if you're born during the day, or your moon sign, especially if you're born at night. So the rising sign changes signs every hour or two during the course of the day, whereas the moon sign takes about 2 days to change signs, and the sun sign takes about a month to change signs. So as a result of that, the rising sign is much more personally relevant to you, and for that reason, I would really focus on that when you're looking at these horoscopes, or horoscopes in general for that matter. So if you don't know what your rising sign is, then all you need to do is find out your birth time and then go to a website where you can get your birth chart calculated, such as astro.com, and you should be able to get your ascendant or your birth rising sign calculated on those websites. So I have a video tutorial titled How to Calculate Your Ascendant and Rising Sign on my channel, which you can either search for or I'll put a link to it in the upper corner of this video right here. So let me know in the comments below what your sun, moon, and rising signs are, and which sign resonates with you more when you watch your video horoscopes like this one. Alright, Aquarius, let's jump into your astrological transits for 2022. So here's a planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the year. I wanted to first start by talking about the Venus retrograde transit in Capricorn, which we start out the year with in your 12th house. So the 12th house is kind of a tricky house. It's typically one of the more challenging ones that has to do with traditionally things like enemies, ailments, sometimes loss, but also just themes of seclusion and isolation. So the Venus retrograde transit actually started out late last year in December of 2021 when it stationed retrograde conjoining Pluto. But this transit's going to extend all the way until early March because it's not until March that Venus will finally depart from Capricorn and move into Aquarius on March 6th. So that extends the operative period all the way until early March for the first couple of months of this year. So here is your 12th house, Capricorn, and the planet Venus. So the 12th house having to do with loss and seclusion, and Venus being a social planet can sometimes just indicate a period of greater isolation where socially maybe you're more withdrawn or you're not able to form connections with people as much as you want, just because this retrograde is happening in your 12th house. And that can be kind of difficult and can be kind of an intense introspective period in which you feel a little bit of tensions as a result of some of those social disconnections, because Pluto is the planet of intensity, of power, sometimes power struggles. One of the things you have to be careful about anytime there's a 12th house transit is the potential for accidentally getting into conflicts with like people that you don't get along with or potentially with enemies. So a Venus retrograde period could be related to that, or creating an enemy out of somebody that used to be a friend, or an enemy who used to be somebody that perhaps you had some sort of relationship with or a romantic relationship with. So Venus-Pluto conjunctions in particular are tricky because they sometimes represent like obsessions in terms of romantic relationships or becoming fixated on something, and perhaps becoming fixated a little bit too much. It's also a good period to go back and reflect on and think about ways in which potentially you've sort of undermined yourself in the past and ways that you could go back and look at some of those instances and figure out ways to improve yourself going forward. So there's often an introspective and a looking backward quality to Venus, because sometimes the Venus retrograde periods repeat in the same spot in the zodiac roughly approximately every 8 years. So in order to understand this Venus retrograde period, you can look back to the last time we had one like this in 2014, or 8 years before that, or 8 years before that, depending on how old you are. So some challenges coming up in the sphere of sort of like relationships, the potential for people you don't get along with, or the potential for self-undoing, or just feeling more secluded and more isolated than usual. So the pace of this and this focus will actually intensify a little bit later in January, when the planet Mars moves into Capricorn on the 24th of that month, joining Venus. And not long after, later that week, Venus will actually station direct in Capricorn on January 29th. And then the two will be moving together and conjoining each other off and on in Capricorn all the way until early March, when eventually on March 6th, both Mars and Venus will depart from Capricorn. So Mars transits, Mars is going to bring some added focus and activity and quickness to some of these 12th house transits of Venus, but it also may bring in an element of conflict and discord and contentiousness when it comes to some of those 12th house figures. So this may be a period in which you find yourself butting heads with somebody that you don't get along with. Be a little bit careful not to go overboard or to say something in the heat of the moment that you later regret, because sometimes we can accidentally make long-term enemies out of people by saying something that seems appropriate in the heat of the moment, but then later in retrospect, you end up regretting or wish you had phrased differently so as to not create a larger issue out of a smaller one. It can also be a period of addressing sometimes like health issues, if there's some acute issues that come up during this time, trying to address them in a decisive way, because decisiveness is usually a good constructive Mars signification that can be useful. So I'm trying to think of any other delineations that are important about the 12th house. It's usually just kind of a tricky house to deal with, where some of the more challenging topics come up. But one of the more constructive ones is just sometimes the need to pull back socially from things for a little bit and have a greater period of isolation, and then eventually you'll sort of emerge from that a little bit more refreshed and ready to embrace the world a little bit more than you were when you went into it at the beginning of this transit. So ultimately, it should be productive. All right, so moving on to the next transit I want to talk about is Jupiter has recently ingressed into Pisces and into your second house of finances, income, and possessions. So this is probably one of the more positive transits that you have this year, because Jupiter is the planet of growth and expansion. And when it moves into a person's second house, usually that's a period of growth and expansion when it comes to a person's finances. So basically, this can be a pretty optimistic and a pretty helpful transit when it comes to increasing your financial income or having some sort of financial windfall over the course of the first 4 or 5 months of 2022. So this transit, it began actually in December when Jupiter moved into Pisces. There was a little bit of a preview of this transit between May and June of last year, May, June, and July of last year of 2021, when Jupiter dipped into Pisces very briefly. So there may have been some sort of inkling of some of the themes that will come up for you financially during this time in terms of growth and expansion, but it really gets going in the first quarter or two of 2022. Eventually, Jupiter will retrograde back into Pisces very briefly again at the very end of 2022, between October 28th and December 2nd, to sort of finish things off. But the real brunt of the transit is from now, basically in early January through May 10th. So yeah, if there were any projects that you had been thinking about doing or ideas that you had for expanding your income or creating a more stable financial base, this would be a good time to launch and really get into some of those ventures and undertakings, because you might find it being much more successful financially during this period than you would at other times in your life. So the only thing to be a little bit careful about is that Jupiter is going to conjoin the planet Neptune in early April in your second house, and Neptune can have kind of a illusory quality where on the one hand, there can be a lot of idealism. So you may have a lot of idealism surrounding like your financial outlook, and things may look extremely optimistic at this point in time. However, sometimes Neptune can be a little bit deceptive. So whatever you do financially during this time, or whatever sort of schemes or ventures you launch, try to maintain some sense of groundedness, because you may have a tendency to get carried away and sometimes maybe even get involved in deals that look too good to be true. And sometimes when they look that way, they sometimes turn out later to be too good to be true and not quite what you thought at first. So especially if any financial dealings during this time involve other parties or signing financial contracts, I'd be extremely careful about that, especially around the April 12th timeframe when that Jupiter-Neptune conjunction goes exact, just because the potential for things being a little bit misleading is heightened during that time. But as long as you do your best to try to stay somewhat grounded, I think you should be able to mitigate the worst sort of scenarios of that. And for most of you, it will work out as a relatively constructive and positive and optimistic transit during the course of this year. All right, so that's one part of the Jupiter transit this year. The other Jupiter transit I wanted to talk about is Jupiter is going to move into Aries in May, and it's going to stay there for most of the second half of the year. So Aries for Aquarius rising is your third house of communication, short distance travel, education, as well as siblings, neighbors, and extended relatives such as aunts and uncles and cousins. So there's your third house right there. Jupiter is going to transit into that sign. This can be a great period for growth and expansion when it comes to communication, and basically expanding your life by learning how to communicate better and more effectively. So some people start learning a language during this time. Other people start a blog or start writing a book, or they join a new social networking site where they start learning how to write and learning how to express themselves more clearly and more effectively. So if that's something you've been meaning to do, then this can be a great time to do that, in which you'll find yourself achieving more success and recognition and notoriety for your communication than at other times in your life. It can also be a good time for short distance trips. It can be a good time for building friendships, especially with those that are local to you or are in your immediate vicinity or your neighborhood or your city. If you have any siblings, then this can be a good time in terms of your relationship with your siblings, or if there's been any rockiness in the past, it could be a good time to reconcile with them and sort of patch things up or smooth things over. It can also be a good period just in terms of your interaction with cousins or aunts and uncles or other things like that. In some instances with these transits, when we're talking about other people in different parts of your chart, it can just indicate that there's something positive happening in that person's life at that time, and we're just seeing an echo of it coming up in your chart, even if it's not impacting you directly. So it may be like a sibling has a sudden financial windfall, or like wins the lottery or something like that. So it's something positive in their life that's being represented in your chart, but is not necessarily always directly tied in with something that affects you directly. So that's something to pay attention to and sort of be aware of when it comes to some of these, especially the positive transits through different houses other than the first house, since the first house is really the primary house that represents you in the chart. All right, so that's, again, one of the other probably most positive transits that you have going on this year is that Jupiter transit through your third house of communication, learning, travel, and siblings. The next transit I want to talk about is Saturn is now moving into the second half of its transit through the sign of Aquarius, which is your rising sign and your first house. So the first house is the house of self, of body, character, mind, and appearance. So Saturn transits through the first house can be kind of tricky because it's a period of consolidation and pulling back when it comes to some of those first house topics. So sometimes Saturn transits through the first house as it relates to the physical body can be a period in which there's some sort of obstacle or difficulty that arises with respect to your physical health. And it can be a scenario where either an obstacle arises and you have to expend a great deal of energy and effort trying to push through that, but then eventually at the end of the transit, you kind of overcome it and gain some perspective on life or become better as a result of it. So there's other scenarios where in some instances Saturn transits can be more like a stop sign where you suddenly realize the limitations of that you have more vividly in terms of your body and physical vitality, or in some instances, since the first is also the place of the mind, it can be in terms of your mind and your sort of intellectual capabilities at that time. So this can be due to aging. Saturn transits, for example, can make the process of aging and make you realize how old you're getting, can make that much more stark, and realizing that you're entering into a new phase of your life and that your age is putting or imposing certain limitations on you that you didn't have to deal with earlier in your life. Saturn transits through the first can also relate to one's appearance and like changes in one's appearance. Sometimes these are not always like welcome things, but it can be like a major restructuring in terms of either your appearance or how you present yourself to the world. Since the first house is also the house of one's character, sometimes during this time you can have more of a severe or almost reclusive or maybe sort of a period of feeling a little bit more down or depressed in some way, because Saturn transits can tend to be kind of slow and kind of heavy. So over the past year, since from December of 2020 through most of 2021, we had Jupiter transiting through Aquarius and kind of balancing things out a little bit so that some of the more depressive tendencies of Saturn were balanced out by the more optimistic tendencies of Jupiter. And that was kind of helping us out a little bit off and on for most of 2021. But now that Jupiter has departed from Aquarius and moved into Pisces, Jupiter's no longer balancing Saturn out. So some of the more cold and slow tendencies of Saturn are going to be impressing itself on your mind and body with a little bit less reserve than before. So the good news is that because this is a transit that's been happening off and on starting around March or April of 2020, and then definitely since December of 2020, most of the themes associated with this are probably things that you've already been dealing with and you're already familiar with, so it shouldn't really be anything new, but instead it's moving into the second half of an ongoing phase or an ongoing process that you've been wrestling with in terms of first house topics over the past year or two, and sort of eventually hopefully bringing that to completion, because this is really the last year of the Saturn transit, since Saturn is going to depart from Aquarius and move into Pisces in March of 2023. So really it's just 2022 when we're dealing with the rest of this Saturn transit through Aquarius. So I did want to mention that Mars is going to conjoin Saturn in early April in the sign of Aquarius, and this could bring up some of the issues that you've already been dealing with in terms of this long-term Saturn transit and make them a little bit more pressing or make some things a little bit more acute during that time period so that it sort of forces you to address them more quickly than you may have been up to this point. So the transit begins on March 6th when Mars moves into Aquarius and into your first house, where it's going to build up to the conjunction with Saturn, which it will eventually complete on April 4th and 5th. And then eventually the transit will be over the following month, just a little bit over a month later, on April 14th, when Mars moves into the sign of Pisces and departs from your rising sign. So this is Mars going into your first house. So first house transits can be periods of Mars specifically, can be periods in which you find yourself expending a lot of additional energy and working a lot harder for a period of time. Like there may be a project that requires concerted effort over the course of that month or that month and a half, where you have to push yourself further than you might normally go otherwise. And that can be okay if you've got a specific thing that you have to get done. So one of the things that's tricky about Mars-Saturn conjunctions, though, is they can give you extremes of hot and cold or fast and slow, so that you're going to feel like you're being pulled in two different directions at the same time, which can cause a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety in some instances, either physically in terms of your physical body and just like extra stress on your physical body at this time, or alternatively, it could be mentally in terms of just your mental state at this time and experiencing a greater amount of internal stress and anxiety. So I would just try to be moderate to whatever extent you can. Try to be careful. For those of you with day charts especially, Mars transits through the first house can cause you to be a little bit more irritable, a little bit more angry, and a little bit more quick to be impulsive. But sometimes when we do things impulsively, that can cause us to get into accidents or have injuries, doing something that if we had thought things out or been a little bit more careful, we might have avoided. So that might be something to be a little bit careful about, both short-term sort of accidents and injuries with that Mars transit through the first house conjoining Saturn, as well as perhaps it just bringing up some of the long-term Saturn issues you've been dealing with for the past year or two and forcing you to confront them and act more decisively in order to improve your physical and mental health. So that's part of what's going on this year. Also relevant to that in the overall Saturn transit is that Saturn is still squaring Uranus off and on this year, especially in the third quarter. It's going to peak again between September and October. So the Saturn-Uranus transit was one of our major signature transits of 2021, where we had 3 exact squares between Saturn and Uranus, the last one of which went exact towards the end of December of 2021. But as we can see in this graph from Archetypal Explorer, there's going to be one more very close square where it doesn't go exact, but it gets within a degree between September and October. So this is a square between Saturn, which is in your first house of mind, body, character, and appearance, and Uranus, which is transiting your fourth house of home, family, and private life. So there's Uranus, there's Saturn. Uranus has been moving through your fourth house of home and family for the past few years, since around 2018, and Uranus can represent major changes and fluctuations and unexpected circumstances happening with your home and living situation, or in some instances with respect to your parents. And somehow there's some tensions that are going on between some of those fourth house transits in terms of your home or your family and your first house of mind, body, and self. So some of these are, again, just like pulling you in different directions between having to focus on first house matters pertaining to your health, your body, or your mind, and your fourth house of your home, living situation, and your parents. So some of this is like an ongoing series of events or series of changes that you've already experienced most of 2021, and we're just going to be kind of wrapping it up in the third quarter of 2022. But I wanted to mention it because, even though it's wrapping up, because there's something that intensifies the Uranus transit this year, because we're starting to have eclipses in the sign of Taurus, where Uranus is transiting in your fourth house, as well as eclipses in Scorpio, which is your 10th house of career, reputation, and overall life direction. So let's talk about the eclipses. So the eclipses are going to happen in those two signs starting in late April and early May, and then again in late October and early November. And my keywords for eclipses are that eclipses signify great beginnings and great endings. So for you, major beginnings and major endings in the sphere of home and family and private life, as well as in the sphere of career, reputation, and overall life direction. So for some people with fourth house eclipses, this can indicate getting a new living situation or moving to a new location, having some sort of major development when it comes to your home and living situation that either represents a major ending or a major beginning. In some instances, since the fourth house also represents your family and your parents, it can be either something about a new chapter when it comes to your relationship with your parents, or something significant happening in your parents' life that is sort of being echoed in your life, but that represents a major beginning or major ending for them. In terms of the 10th house eclipses, sometimes this can represent starting a major new job or major new career venture, or beginning a major new chapter in terms of your career and overall life direction. Like maybe you've hit a new peak period or a new major point in your life in terms of achieving some sort of recognition or accomplishing some sort of goal that you set out to do a long time ago. So that's the sort of major, that can be like the culmination or the ending part once you reach the sort of pinnacle of some sort of upward climb that you initiated many years ago. In other instances, sometimes when eclipse happens in the 10th house, it can also represent an ending. So in some instances, you have to, when something's reaching the end of its life cycle, you've got to wrap things up and sort of wind things down when it comes to one career. That way you can move forward into whatever the next chapter of your life is. So ultimately, major endings and major beginnings in home and family and career and overall life direction. And that's probably one of the most important signature transits that are happening this year. But it's really, it's going to amp up some of the Uranus stuff in your fourth house. And it's also going to be tied in with some of the Saturn stuff going on in your first house. So important to pay attention to. All right, one last transit I wanted to touch on is the Mars retrograde that's going to happen in the sign of Gemini, which is your fifth house. The fifth house is the house that has to do with children, creativity, and just artistic matters, but also things having to do with pleasure, what you do for fun, but also sex and sexuality. So the Mars retrograde is going to take place in this house. It's going to begin in August when Mars first moves into the sign of Gemini around August 20th. And then it's going to begin building up to the retrograde, and it's going to already activate some of those fifth house topics. But then eventually there's going to be a sudden intensification of things around October 30th when Mars slows down in the sky and does a U-turn, sort of stops in the middle of the zodiac and then begins moving backwards or walking backwards to earlier parts of Gemini that it already moved through. So Mars transits through the fifth house. On the one hand, it could just be a period in which you're putting in more work or you're putting in a lot more effort towards fifth house topics. So this could be, if you have children, for example, you could have to put in a lot more work towards raising your children for some reason, or putting a lot more effort and focus on what's going on in their life. For some people, their children might be going through like a tumultuous period, so you could have some tensions or some like anxiety surrounding your children during this time for some reason. Maybe they have something important going on that's causing stress for you in your life or stress in your relationship with them. Another possible area when it comes to Mars retrograde in the fifth house can be conflicts surrounding creative matters. Maybe you've put something out creatively into the world, but it gets critiqued in a way that's like challenging, or somebody challenges you about something that you've created at that time and you have to like defend it or fight for it in some way. Fighting is a classic Mars signification. And then finally, in terms of sex and sexuality, you can find Mars retrogrades being a period in which you find yourself being a lot more sexual, or you find yourself in a relationship that's requiring a lot more energy and output on your part in order to maintain that sort of romantic relationship. It can also be a period in which there can be some sort of conflict or discord or some sort of issue that arises that you have to work through that relates to sex and sexuality. And for some of you, that's going to be more constructive, especially if you have night charts. For those of you with day charts, it could be more of like some sort of conflict or some sort of falling out with a lover or something like that you might want to be careful about, especially if there's any ways that you could mitigate it by not doing something or saying something impulsive in the heat of the moment that perhaps you end up regretting later on. So I think that's the major transit. So that retrograde, it's actually going to go into the early part of 2023. So we're just getting the first part of it in 2022, and then it'll wrap up in the early months of 2023. So that's something that carries forward into next year. And since this is a forecast for 2022, I don't want to go into that too much because this is already long enough. So let me see if there's anything else I meant to mention, but I think I went through all of my major graphs. I showed the Venus retrograde conjunct Pluto, the Jupiter Neptune, the Mars Saturn. So I think that's it. So thanks for watching this forecast. Good luck in 2022, and I'll see you again in 2023. All right, that's it for this horoscope forecast for 2022. So as always, this was just a general forecast that focuses on some of the broad outlines of the year ahead. So if you'd like a more detailed analysis of some of the general transits this year, then be sure to check out our year ahead forecast for 2022 that we released in December. Additionally, for a more detailed analysis of your chart, you might want to get a consultation with an astrologer because they can look at it in much more detail than I can go into here in just a general horoscope. Alternatively, or better yet, you could also learn how to read your birth chart and transits on your own, which would allow you to pinpoint some of the dates involved with much more precision and exactness. So if you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then you can get a copy of my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune. And in this book, I reconstructed the original system of Western astrology and recovered some techniques that we had lost many centuries ago. So with this book, I sort of teach you how to read a birth chart and how to use different timing techniques in order to determine when different things will happen during the course of your life, or in some instances during the course of a single year, as I've attempted to do in this horoscope forecast. So the book is available on Amazon as well as in other fine bookstores everywhere. I also teach an online course on ancient astrology, which has over 100 hours of video lectures. It shows hundreds of different example charts in order to show you how the different techniques work in practice. And it really gets into details that I couldn't go into as much in my book, even though the book is very big. In the course, I actually get into a lot more example charts, which really gives you better hands-on experience of how to use astrology to read birth charts in practice. So you can find out more information about that at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, I also recently released my 2022 Electional Astrology Report, where I went through the year and I picked out some of the most auspicious or lucky dates with one lucky date or electional chart for each of the next 12 months. So these are useful for starting different types of ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. The report is also available at courses.theastrologyschool.com. All right, so that's it. So thanks for watching. Good luck in 2022, and may the stars be ever in your favor. Special thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Morgan McKinsey, and Kristen Otero. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly auspicious elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountainastrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for both iPhone and Android at astrogold.io. There are also two major astrology conferences happening this year. The first is the Northwest Astrological Conference, happening May 26th through the 30th, 2022, near Seattle, Washington. Find out more information at norwac.net. And the second is the International Society for Astrological Research Conference, which is taking place August 25th through the 29th, 2022, in Westminster, Colorado. And you can find out more information about that at isar2022.org.